Deathworlders are long extinct, the professor mocked. Then the Deathworld girl froze the war beast. The hand went up from the back row, and the room went quiet the way rooms go quiet when something has broken a rule no one knew existed. Provost Scholar Dehen Orath had been mid-sentence. He did not lose the thread. 61 years of lecturing had made him immune to interruption. But he paused, the way a machine pauses when it reads an unexpected input and decides what category to file it under. 200 students, 11 species, all of them turned now toward seat 4401E, and the small human woman sitting in it with her hands folded on the desk and her face carrying exactly no expression. Velthos, at the side monitoring station, checked his instruments. His pupils had contracted to about 70% of standard diameter. He did not know why yet. He filed that data point away. The hand was still up. 17 hours earlier, the recycled air in intake processing had smelled like nothing. Velthos had always found this appropriate. The Institute processed life from 31 worlds, and the air tasted of none of them, a kind of diplomatic neutrality enforced by the ventilation system. He had worked in it for 6 years without complaint. He was good at this job. He had processed over 1,000 observers. He could read a species' stress markers before they crossed the threshold, the micro-tremble in a Rithani's secondary eyelids, the way a Soltari's throat stripe flickered gold when it was performing calm rather than feeling it. He calibrated room temperature to the median comfort of 4 concurrent species. He filed complete intake forms in under 3 minutes. Form 4401E took him 4. The planet of origin field returned nothing. He tried 2 alternate spellings of the entry the observer had written, small, neat letters, no corrections, still nothing. He ran a fringe registry search, the secondary index for edge case and unverified systems. A partial match appeared, Terran body, Class 5 designation, archive grade, no verified sapient presence, C classification, filing 4401. He read it twice. He checked the unclassified fringe registry box. He routed the form to Provost Scholar Orath for co-signature, as required when a species did not appear in the primary grid. Orath co-signed in under 30 seconds. His signature was impeccable. Velthos printed the form, slid it into its sleeve, and looked up. The observer was standing at the counter. He had not heard her approach, which was the first wrong detail. His station was polished stone, and everyone crossed it making some sound. He issued her the badge. She looked at it, did not smile, did not thank him, did not ask questions. "Back row," she said. He confirmed. She took the badge and went. He watched her cross the corridor. His instruments registered her mass as inconsistent with her visual volume. The scanner wanted to flag it as a calibration error, and he nearly let it. Instead, he made a note in her file, unusual mass distribution, possible gravitational adaptation. Monitor. He filed the form. He moved to the next intake. He would spend a long time thinking about that note. The grid had reviewed 4,400 worlds. That number was on the first slide of Orath's seminar, large and clean against a black field. Velthos knew the slide. He had seen versions of this lecture 3 times from his monitoring station. Orath ran it at the start of every enrollment cycle, and it was, by any measure, a good lecture. Rigorous, immaculate. The conclusions landed with the satisfaction of a door closing on a room that has been properly organized. "Those 4,400 bodies," Orath said, moving across the front of the hall with the ease of a person who has owned a room for 6 decades, 31 were designated Class 4 or Class 5, what the grid formally calls the implausible sapient threshold. Worlds where the environmental load exceeds what evolutionary theory predicts a sapient nervous system could develop under. In every one of those 31 cases, the grid's assessment has held. No verified sapient visitor, no challenge, no exception. He advanced the slide. Earth filled the projection. Blue-green, the cloud systems rendered in slow motion, peaceful-looking in the way that only things viewed from very far away look peaceful. Case number 4401, Earth, oxygen-reactive atmosphere, corrosive on contact with most biological membranes, tectonic instability rated at the upper boundary of Class 5, surface water in a destabilizing liquid state covering 71% of the surface, apex predators operating on both scent and thermal signature, a biosphere that, in our assessment, selects against sapient development with remarkable consistency. He let that land. The few recovered artifacts suggest only pre-Toulouse biological activity before the biosphere completed its work. Earth is, in the grid's formal language, archive grade, in my language, a closed case. The room accepted this, it always did. Velthos monitored. His pupils were at standard diameter. He ran his eyes across the 200 students, the small distress flickers that a lecture on predator world biospheres reliably produced, the Rithani third years in the left tier who always sat together, the new Vori cohort who still hadn't learned to suppress their skin pulse in large rooms. His gaze reached the back row. Seat 4401E. Her pupils had not moved. He checked his instruments again because he was a person who verified things. The reading was the same. Every other student in the room was showing some degree of autonomic response to the footage of Terran apex predators now cycling on the projection. She was showing none. He made a note. He did not know what to title it, so he wrote, Observer 4401E, no visible distress response to Terran predator stimulus. Species typical, no file to compare. He had been doing this job for 6 years, and he had never written no file to compare before. Stay close. What she does next, and what it breaks, is the part of this story the grid will still be arguing about 100 years from now. The hand went up, and the room went quiet. Velthos's pupils were at 70% and dropping. Orath had been mid-sentence on the segue to his next case study, a Class 4 body in the outer arm that had taken 40 years to definitively close. He stopped. He turned, with the patient courtesy of someone who has been interrupted many times and found it educational none of those times. Yes, he said. Her voice carried without effort, not loud, just placed correctly in the room, the way you place a tool when you know exactly what you need it to do. What's the fatality rate for a species challenging its own classification? A few students shifted. Velthos watched Orath's throat stripe. Gold, still confident, still performing, but the pulse was slightly faster than usual. Understandably, Orath said, you may not be familiar with grid protocol. A species cannot initiate a classification challenge on its own behalf. The grid requires a corroborating third-party sapient verification before a challenge is even filed. It is a safeguard against anomalous self-reports. The process simply doesn't apply in this case. She said, right, and sat back down. The room exhaled without knowing it had been holding. Orath moved on to his next case. The lecture continued, seamless, and within 2 minutes, the rhythm of it had covered the moment over like water closing over a stone. Velthos did not move on. He pulled up Form 4401E on his terminal. He wasn't sure why, only that his fingers went there and read it again. The blank species field. Orath's signature, clean and fast, 30 seconds worth of attention given to a document that would later be described in the grid's amendment proceedings as the administrative instrument of its own undoing. He stared at it, he tabbed away, he told himself the note in the file was enough. Her eyes were forward, her hands were folded. Her expression had not changed from the moment she walked in. The instruments were still trying to categorize it and still failing. The readout kept cycling through non-aggression, non-submission, non-recognition of hierarchy, and landing on a blinking field that read unclassified. He had seen that word twice today. He did not think this was a coincidence. He could not yet explain why. The seminar ended 40 minutes later. Orath thanked the room. 200 students gathered their things. Velthos closed his monitoring log, stood, and watched seat 4401E from across the hall. She was the last to rise. She tucked a worn paper notebook, actual paper, which almost no one used anymore, under her arm, and walked out without looking back. His pupils were at 55% of standard. He did not file a report about the notebook. He would think about that later. The corridor outside Lecture Hall 9 smelled, to Velthos, of recycled air and the faint mineral trace that the iron filtration system left on every surface. He had walked it so many times, the smell had become invisible to him, background data, filed and ignored. He caught up with her near the junction between the lecture wing and the research arcade. His observer support mandate covered exactly this: post-session orientation, any questions about campus routing or grid procedure. He had used it as a reason to follow up with nervous first days before. It was professional. It was appropriate. He said, "If you have questions about procedure or about campus orientation, I'm available to help." She stopped walking, not because he'd surprised her. He had the clear impression she'd known he was there before he spoke. She turned and looked at him with the same expression she'd worn in the seminar. The instruments on his wrist monitor read it as non-aggression, non-submission, non-recognition of hierarchy, and then went back to blinking unclassified. "Where's the biological containment wing?" she said. He explained carefully that biological containment wing C was restricted to approved research personnel. It was not part of the observer routing. It was, in fact, sealed behind a second pressure door that required a cleared access code. She said, "I know, I could smell it from the lecture hall." He stood in the corridor for a moment with nothing to say. His pupils went to 50%. "From the hall," he repeated. "The cleaning compound they use on the enclosures and something underneath it," she considered briefly, "something that hadn't been cleaned." Velthos's monitoring station was adjacent to the hall. He had been in that building for 6 years. He had never once detected anything from Wing C, which was 80 meters away, pressure-sealed, and running its own separate ventilation loop. He filed a note when he returned to his desk. Observer 4401E identifies location of restricted research wing by olfactory trace through pressure-sealed corridors, distance approximately 80 meters. Requesting clarification on species sensory range. He sent it to the species registry department. They replied the same cycle. No file exists for listed species. Query cannot be processed. Recommend resubmission with corroborating species documentation. He marked the note pending. It would stay that way for the rest of his time at the institute. He had 8 other observers to manage that cycle. He managed them. He also, in the gaps between, kept Sierra at the edge of his professional attention, the way you keep a reading on a piece of equipment that's been behaving strangely, not watching it exactly, but aware. What he noted: she slept 4 hours. He knew this because the dormitory's environmental log flagged her room as having maintained alert temperature settings, the warmer setting most species requested when awake, for 20 of every 24 hours. He checked the log twice to make sure the system wasn't misreading. She ate from the dispensary, but not what anyone else was eating. She selected from the section flagged extreme thermal content, advisory notice for sensitive biological membranes, which existed primarily for the 2 Vrethani researchers who needed food that would have scorched the lining from a Vori throat. She ate it without water. She ate it quickly, the way someone eats when they are not thinking about the food at all. 3 students from different species approached her in the main corridor over 2 days. He wasn't in earshot for any of the conversations, but he watched the body language. They came at her sideways, the way people approach something they've already decided they want to talk to, but haven't committed to yet. She answered. Brief. Whatever she said was enough that all 3 walked away looking like they'd gotten more than they'd expected. The 4th student was a Rithani 4th year named Osek, who Velthos knew slightly because Osek asked questions about everything and had once spent 40 minutes at the intake desk wanting to understand the grid's tier naming convention in depth. Osek stopped Sierra near the Dome Gardens. Velthos was close enough this time. "Are you nervous?" Osek asked, "about the predator research animals on campus?" Sierra looked at him, 3 sets of eyelids fully open, which in a Rithani meant genuine attention and also some anxiety. She was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone searching for the right word, but the quiet of someone deciding how much of the right word to give. "No," she said. Osek waited, nothing more came. "Not at all," Osek said. "Not particularly." She looked toward the Dome Gardens, where the gas giant was coming around the station's eastern arc, its bands of ochre and rust filling the curved glass. I've been around worse. Osek opened his middle set of eyelids, curiosity, in Rithani, and said, worse than a Class 4 apex specimen. She didn't answer that one. She looked at the gas giant for another moment, then walked on. Velthos's pupil diameter was at 45%. He filed nothing about this conversation. Some data, he was beginning to understand, was too specific to know what category to put it in until later. On the third day, he pulled the Predator's stress response trial reports. He was not required to. It was outside his observer support brief. He did it anyway, the same way he'd gone back to Form 4401E 3 times, the same way he'd sent the unanswerable query to Species Registry, because something in his processing kept returning him to the same point, the way a probe keeps returning to the same gravitational center. The trial records covered the 11 enrolled species. 7 showed high-amplitude distress responses to apex predator stimulus, even behind containment glass, even in a controlled setting, even knowing the glass was there. The Vori cohort had the highest readings. 2 species had submitted medical exemptions from the trials entirely. 1, the senior Rithani group, had moderate readings, the kind that came from training rather than biology. He looked for a reading from seat 4401E. There was none. She hadn't been through the trial protocol yet. Observer track students weren't required to participate. He sat with that for a while. He thought about her question in the seminar. What's the fatality rate for a species challenging its own classification? She had asked it knowing the answer. He was now certain of this. She hadn't been asking because she didn't know the process didn't exist. She'd been checking whether Orath did. Whether the man who classified her world as dead understood, at the foundational level, what it would take for that classification to be wrong. Orath had told her nothing because the process didn't apply. She had said right and sat back down. His pupils were at 40%. He typed one line into the open notes field of Form 4401E and stared at it for a full minute before deciding not to send it anywhere. I believe I have made an error in the species origin field. I am not certain what the correct entry is. He did not send it. He did not know who to send it to. He closed the form. The breach alarm would fire in 11 hours. He found out about the Vorak specimen the same way he found out about most things at the Institute, through the Daily Logistics Digest, which arrived at 0600, and which he read the way people read things they don't expect to need. The Vorak had been transferred to Wing C from an outer arm research vessel 3 weeks ago, Class 4 Apex, stress response research animal. Its intake profile noted, no social compliance reflexes, no species cohabitation history. Responds to all threat signals. The protocol for its enclosure required 2 separate containment locks, both keyed independently. The note at the bottom of the intake profile, added by the receiving researcher, read, primary restraint intact, secondary restraint pending installation, scheduled this cycle. He read that line. He read it again. He cross-referenced the date. The secondary restraint was scheduled for installation that morning. The same morning Wing C's maintenance crew was listed as running a systems calibration on the ventilation loop. He sat very still. He sent a query to Wing C's duty coordinator. Standard language, observer support framing. Can you confirm secondary containment for specimen VRK-04 is in place prior to the open building period? The reply came back 40 minutes later. Confirmed, scheduled for 14:00 installation. Wing is cleared per standard protocol pending completion. He read scheduled for 14:00 3 times. He filed an advisory. He marked it non-urgent. He told himself the duty coordinator knew the protocol. He told himself the maintenance crew knew the schedule. He told himself the Institute had run these procedures for decades without incident. Then he thought about what was sitting in the back row of Lecture Hall 9, the being with no stress signals, no file, no classification. And he thought about the form he'd checked without knowing what he was checking, and the thing that had been scheduled for installation at 14:00 00 that hadn't been installed yet. His skin pulse fired once, involuntarily, in the blue-white frequency that his species broadcast when it was frightened. He was alone in his office. There was no one to read it. He looked at his terminal clock. It was 13:44. The follow-up session in Lecture Hall 9, Orath's continuation seminar, had started at 13:30. He was running before he finished the thought. The corridor between his office and Lecture Hall 9 was 60 meters. He knew this because he had walked it every working day for 6 years and had never once thought about how long it would take to run it. Now he was finding out. His forearms pumped in the awkward alternating rhythm that Vori weren't built for. His species moved fast in short bursts, not sustained sprints, and the recycled air burned in his throat, and his skin pulse was firing continuously, blue-white, the full distress broadcast, which he couldn't suppress and didn't try. The breach alarm was still sounding, short, clipped intervals, not the continuous tone that meant the Vorak hadn't been located yet, which meant the secondary response team hadn't contained it, which meant he had been right about the schedule and wrong to mark the advisory non-urgent, and the 40-second window for manual node activation was either already closed or closing right now. He hit the hall doors at a run and came through them into chaos. 200 students, 11 species worth of panic signals firing at once, Rithani distress clicks, Vori skin pulse flooding the air blue, a high-pitched tonal cry from the Shanathi delegation that Velthos's body responded to before his brain did, his secondary eyelids slamming down on instinct. Desks overturned. Someone had gone for the emergency exit on the upper tier, and the door wasn't opening, sealed during breach, correct protocol. 3 students were pressed against the far wall. One was halfway up it, fingers finding holds in the stone, seams with a focus that suggested they had done something like this before. And at the front of the hall, Orath. His back was against the wall beside the lecture display. His throat stripe had gone dark, not the fast pulse of performance confidence, but flat suppression, which meant his body was doing the calculation his face wasn't showing. He had 4 arms, and he had pressed 2 of them flat to the wall behind him. The Vorak was in the hall. Velthos had seen it in its enclosure. Once, through the observation glass, during a scheduled tour, it had not looked particularly threatening through glass. What he understood now, with no glass between them, was that the glass had been doing a great deal of work he hadn't appreciated. The Vorak was built the way things were built on worlds that selected hard, low and long, and very quiet for its size, the kind of quiet that wasn't the absence of movement, but the compression of it, everything coiled. It was reading the room. He could see it doing this. The way its weight shifted fractionally toward the highest amplitude signals, tracking, sorting, running its own intake process. His skin pulse was the highest amplitude signal in the room. He knew this. He could not stop it. The east wall, the manual node. He had the count, 40 seconds from alarm to containment field. He didn't know how much of that window was left. He started moving along the wall. The Vorak's head turned. It registered him. He felt this the way you feel a change in air pressure before you hear the storm. Something in the room shifted its attention, and the shift was physical, a weight. His pupils slammed to pinpoints. His legs kept moving because he told them to, and not for any other reason. Then Sierra stepped in front of it. She had been in the back row. She had come down through the panicking students without him seeing her move. One moment she was at the top of the tiered seating, and then she was on the floor of the hall, between the Vorak and the room, in the space that had been empty. No armor, no weapon, nothing in her hands. She had not spoken to anyone. The Vorak stopped. Velthos stopped. The east wall was 6 meters away. His hand was raised toward the node panel. He did not close the distance. He would explain this later in his incident report as observation period required before protocol action. He knew, writing that line, that it wasn't accurate. What had actually happened was that he had looked at what was in front of him, and his body had made a decision his training hadn't covered. He counted. He did it on instinct, because counting was what he did when he needed to hold onto something. 4 seconds. She didn't submit. She didn't broadcast. Every species in that room was running some version of a fear response. The Vorak could read all of them, had been reading all of them since it came through the door, and she was putting out nothing that his instruments could detect from 6 meters. Not suppressed, the way Orath's stripe had gone dark. Absent. Her respiratory rate hadn't changed. Her pupils were the same size they had been in the seminar, the same size they had been when she asked about fatality rates and sat back down. She was looking at the Vorak the way his instruments looked at a new intake, measuring, patient, already done with the part where you decide if you're afraid. The Vorak's weight shifted. Enough. One word, low, not loud, not sharp, placed, the way she placed everything, with exactly the force required and none left over. The register of something that has said this before, not to predators specifically, but to the category of situation a predator represented and been heard. The Vorak stepped back. Once, twice. It kept her in its peripheral track. It did not take its attention off her and moved back through the door it had come from. Not running, not driven. It left because it had made a decision, and Vel'Thos would spend a very long time thinking about what that decision had been based on. He reached the node. He activated it. The containment field sealed with a sound like a pressure door closing, clean and final. The corridor outside the field was empty. The secondary response team, arriving 40 seconds behind schedule, would find the Vorak in its enclosure. Their report would describe this as anomalous specimen behavior, returned to containment without assistance. The report did not speculate on why. Vel'Thos did not move from the node panel for a moment. His pupils were, by his own subsequent measurement, fully occluded. Light was entering, but he wasn't processing it. He would list this in his medical report as suspected instrument malfunction. He knew it wasn't. Sira turned to Orath. His throat stripe had not relit. She looked at him the way she looked at everything, even, unhurried, the baseline expression that his instruments couldn't categorize, and said, "You may want to check whether the node operator is rated for 40-meter sprints." Orath said nothing. She picked up her notebook from the floor where it had fallen during the evacuation, tucked it under her arm, and walked to the exit. The sealed door had already cycled open, breach resolved, protocol complete. She left without looking back. The room was quiet. 200 students and one provost scholar, standing in the specific silence that follows when something has happened and the language for describing it hasn't been built yet. Vel'Thos activated his terminal and began the incident report. He typed for 3 minutes. Then he deleted everything he'd written and started again. He completed the medical scan of Sira the next morning. This was standard post-incident protocol for all persons present during a containment breach. He had done these before. He had never had results like these before. Organ density, irregular. Bone composition reading at a mass ratio that the scanner kept flagging as outside standard parameters, possible calibration error. Cardiac pressure at rest was running near what the machine classified as elevated emergency threshold for every species in its database, which meant either she was in physiological crisis or the database was wrong about what her baseline looked like. Immune markers at permanent elevated readiness, not activated, not responding to a current threat, simply running at a level that the scanner associated with acute infection in other species. Just running there, constant, the way a body ran at that level when it had decided that was the correct setting for the environment it lived in. He filed the results under unclassifiable resilience. He sat with that phrase for a moment before submitting it, because it was the most honest thing he had written in the 4 days since she walked in. He sent a message to the Classification Review Board. 1 line, 1 attachment. Attached Form 4401E filed and co-signed by this office upon observer intake, Korvath Station. Planet of origin, Earth, grid filing 4401. I believe you will find the relevant note in the species origin field. He did not explain what the relevant note said. He didn't think he needed to. The board's acknowledgement arrived within the hour. A convening notice followed before the day was out. The subject line read, Emergency Classification Review, Earth, filing 4401, potential status amendment. Velthos read it. His pupils were at 38% of standard, the lowest reading he'd recorded since the seminar, because the seminar had been before he understood what he was looking at. He pulled up Form 4401E one more time. Orath's signature, his own note, awaiting corroborating file, the line he hadn't sent, "I believe I have made an error in the species origin field." He thought about what error, exactly, he had made. The error wasn't the box he'd checked. The fringe registry box was the only option the system gave him. The error was the system's, and the system was Orath's, and Orath had signed the form in 30 seconds, and the form was now attached to a classification review that was going to dismantle 61 years of doctrine. He had filed a pending note. He had sent an unanswerable query. He had marked an advisory non-urgent. He had run into the hall and stopped at the node and stood there with occluded pupils watching a Class 4 apex specimen make a decision. He had done all of this correctly, by every standard the Institute had given him. He thought the standards were built on the same assumption as the form. He typed a final note into the file, not the unsent line, a new one. The system processed her before it classified her. The classification was filed first. The processing was filed 30 seconds later. I would like it noted that the order matters. He sent it to the review board as an addendum. He marked it for the record. The classification review board convened in Hall 3, which was smaller than Lecture Hall 9 and smelled of the same recycled air and nothing else. Velthos had been in Hall 3 twice before, both times as a filing witness, both times for species disputes that had resolved without drama. He sat at the examiner's table to the left of the session chair, his terminal open, his role today listed as intake documentation support. He had a clear view of both tables. Orath arrived first. He set his documentation on the table in a precise stack, 61 years of it, organized by publication date, the earliest papers on the bottom and the most recent on top. The stack was thick. He arranged it with the care of someone who believes the weight of a thing is itself an argument. He sat. His throat stripe pulsed gold, slow and steady, confident, still. Sierra arrived 2 minutes later. She set one sheet of paper on the table in front of her. Velthos recognized it. He had printed it. He had filed it. He had routed it to Orath for co-signature and received it back in 30 seconds with a clean, impeccable mark at the bottom. Form 4401E. Assessor Koval called the session to order. Six-limbed, Threnny, 40 years of classification reviews behind her, Velthos had heard she had never once visibly reacted to testimony. She opened the session in the standard form, the filing number, the amendment request, the parties present. Provost Scholar Orath, she said, you have documentation supporting the current Earth classification. Orath spoke for 22 minutes. He was thorough, rigorous, and completely certain. He walked through the methodology, the data, the 31 precedent cases, the evolutionary framework. He cited himself 8 times. The stack of papers diminished as he placed each cited document face up beside him, building a second, smaller stack of authority. At the end, he folded his hands. His throat stripe was still gold. Koval looked at Sierra, and your documentation. Sierra pushed the single sheet to the center of the table. Koval read it, then she read it again. The room was quiet in the way Hall 9 had been quiet when the hand went up, the specific silence of something having broken a rule no one knew existed. She looked up at Orath. Provost Scholar, you co-signed this intake form. Correct, standard procedure for unclassified fringe observers. The co-signature routes the form to the archive pending species verification. The form lists the observer's planet of origin as Earth. Yes. Grid filing 4401. Yes. Which is the filing you authored, classifying Earth as Class 5 hostile, no verified sapient presence, archive grade. A pause. Oh yes. Koval set the form down. She set it down carefully, flat on the table, the way you set down something you want to keep looking at. So the classification authority responsible for designating Earth as incapable of producing sapient life co-signed the intake processing document for a sapient being from Earth. Orath's throat stripe went dark. Vel'Thos watched it happen. The gold pulse simply stopped. Not a flicker, not a fade, it stopped, the way a system stops when it encounters a contradiction it cannot root around. He had worked at the Institute for 6 years, and he had never seen Orath's stripe go dark in a professional setting. He did not file a note. His terminal was open, and his hands were on it, and he did not file a note. Zira spoke once. You didn't classify Earth wrong because you lacked data. You classified it wrong because the data didn't fit the grid. That's a different problem. Koval called a recess. Vel'Thos walked to the water station in the corridor and poured a cup he didn't drink. He stood there with it in his hand, looking at the wall, which was polished stone, and told him nothing. He could hear, from behind the closed doors of Hall 3, the sounds of a 6-person review board in deliberation. Not words, just the rhythm of disagreement working its way toward resolution. He thought about the stack of papers Orath had brought. He thought about the one sheet Zira had brought. He thought about the note he'd typed and not sent. I believe I have made an error in the species origin field. He'd thought, writing it, that the error was his. He understood now that the error was in the field itself, in the assumption that unclassified meant not there, rather than not yet named. He set the cup on the station's edge without drinking. The deliberation ran 4 hours. The vote was unanimous. Koval read the amendment into the record in the same flat, even register she'd read everything else. Grid Classification Amendment 4401E, Earth, Class 5 Hostile, Verified Sapient Presence, Designation, Active. Administrative Note, Form 4401E, filed and co-signed at Observer Intake, Korvath Station, preserved as the primary verification document. She paused. The board further notes, she said, that the verification document in question was generated, processed, and co-signed by the classification authority whose designation is hereby amended. The board considers this administratively significant and directs that the notation be included in the permanent record. Orath gathered his documentation. He did not speak. He stacked the papers with the same precision he had used to lay them out, which Vel'Thos thought was either discipline or the absence of any other way to use his hands. He left the hall. Zira did not watch him go. She was looking at the form, still lying on the table, face up, the blank species field and the 2 signatures. She looked at it the way she looked at everything, even unhurried. Then she picked up her notebook and left. In the corridor, Vel'Thos was still standing by the water station. He said, I should have flagged the form. She stopped, she looked at him. You did flag it, you wrote pending, you just didn't know what you were waiting for. She walked past him. He stood in the corridor for a while. His pupils measured, by the wrist monitor he checked a minute later, at 40% of standard diameter. He filed this as partial recovery. It was the most accurate thing he had written all week. Orath submitted withdrawal notices for 14 papers from the Galactic Index. The stated reason on each was identical: error in foundational assumptions. It was the first mass withdrawal in the index's recorded history. The academic response, for the first week, was silence, not the silence of indifference, but the silence of a field waiting to see which way the thing would fall before they committed to a position. The Institute established a Terran Studies department within the month. They offered Zira a faculty chair. She declined it in one sentence to the department director, a nervous junior academic who had prepared a formal offer packet. I'm not here to teach, I'm here to remind. She agreed to an informal consultation arrangement instead. No title, no office. She could be found near the ornamental lake or the dome gardens or at the food dispensary selecting items from the thermal advisory section. Students began approaching her, carefully, with the body language of beings who have done the calculation and decided the question is worth the risk. She answered, minimum words. When the question was good, she gave slightly more. Vel'Thos was promoted to Classification Review Liaison. His replacement at the monitoring station was a Vori named Sethic who was, per the updated role description, rated for a 40-meter sprint. The description did not explain why this was now a requirement. Everyone on the station knew. Orath did not return. He submitted an independent research leave request. No one pursued the matter. A junior researcher reported that the lights in his office were sometimes on late, that someone was running archive footage in there, old footage, pre-classification Terran satellite data, the kind the grid had gathered before it decided there was nothing worth classifying. No one filed a note about this either. The paper notebook paid off 3 months later when the Terran Studies Department requested Sierra's consultation notes for the curriculum. She said she didn't have any. The director looked at the worn paper notebook she always had under her arm. She looked back at him. She did not explain. He did not ask again. The Terran Studies wing opened without ceremony on a Tuesday, which Vel'Thos noted was not a day the Institute traditionally used for openings. The atrium held a real-time feed of Earth, the cloud systems moving, the blue-green surface looking peaceful from 30 light-years out, the way it always looked from far enough away. Beneath the display, a case. Inside the case, protected behind glass, was a printed copy of Form 4401E. The placard read, Administrative Document 4401E, Observer Intake, Korvath Station. Filed and co-signed upon the arrival of a representative of Earth. Grid Filing 4401, Class 5 Hostile, Verified Sapient Presence, Designation, Active. The Institute officially processed, badged, seated, and listed in the Visitor Register a member of the species it had classified as non-existent. Filing Examiner, Vel'Thos, Intake Examiner, First Grade. He visited on a Tuesday late, when the wing was nearly empty. His pupils were at standard diameter, the first time since the seminar 6 weeks ago that the reading had come back to full. He looked at the form for a long time, at Orath's signature, at his own awaiting corroborating file, at the blank species field. He did not file a note. Sierra left Korvath Station 3 months after the amendment. She did not announce it. Vel'Thos found out when her consultation arrangement expired and generated an automatic renewal request. He processed the cancellation, standard form. He completed it in under 3 minutes. The form's archival designation was added the same day by the Grid's Records Office without fanfare. Primary verification document, first confirmed sapient contact, Earth Terran. His final log entry for file 4401E read, Case closed, species verified, status active. I checked the wrong box. The box was right. He closed the file. He looked at the display case through the wing's open door from where he sat. The blue-green image turned slowly in the feed. The form sat behind its glass. Orath's signature, impeccable. His own note, pending. The grid had reviewed 4,400 worlds. It had not reviewed what sat in the back row.